On the afternoon of August 28, 2003, a man walked into a bank in Erie, Pennsylvania, with a metal collar locked around his neck. He was not a hardened criminal. He was not a career offender. He was a pizza delivery driver named Brian Wells, and he was terrified. He handed a teller a note demanding $250,000. He told the teller the device around his neck was a live explosive. He said he had no choice. Someone had strapped it to him. Someone had told him what to do and where to go. If he did not follow the instructions, he said, it would go off. The teller handed him $8,702. Wells walked out of the PNC Bank branch on Peach Street and got into his car. He did not get far. Erie police had already been called. Officers located Wells in a nearby parking lot within minutes and ordered him out of the vehicle. He complied. He stood in the open, hands raised, the metal collar visible around his neck, telling officers he needed help. He told them it was going to go off. He told them he needed a bomb technician. He told them he did not want to die. He died anyway. At 3:18 in the afternoon, less than 50 minutes after he walked into that bank, the device detonated. Brian Wells collapsed in the parking lot. He was pronounced dead at the scene, and the FBI had a case unlike anything they had ever seen in Western Pennsylvania. What came next would take 7 years to fully unravel. It would reach into the lives of a mentally ill woman with a history of violence, a man who owed money he could not repay, and a conspiracy so convoluted that federal prosecutors would later describe it as one of the most elaborate criminal arrangements ever brought before a federal court. The collar around Brian Wells's neck was not just a murder weapon. It was the final piece of a plan that had been building for months. And the FBI was about to spend years pulling it apart. Brian Douglas Wells was born on November 15, 1956. By the summer of 2003, he was 46 years old and had worked for Mamma Mia's Pizzeria in Erie for years. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. He made deliveries. He kept to himself. He had a small circle of acquaintances in the area around the Peach Street corridor where he worked and lived. Co-workers at the pizzeria remembered him as quiet and reliable, a man who showed up on time and did his job without drama. He was not someone who courted trouble or discussed criminal enterprises or talked about easy money. He was, by every account investigators would later gather, a man who had settled into the modest rhythms of working-class life in Erie and had no apparent ambition to disrupt them. One of those acquaintances was a woman named Marjorie Armstrong. Armstrong was 54 years old in 2003. She had a history that Erie County authorities knew well. She had been charged in 1984 with the fatal shooting of her boyfriend, Robert Thomas, but was found not guilty by reason of insanity after psychiatric evaluation. She had been hospitalized for mental illness on multiple occasions. Neighbors and people who encountered her described her as volatile, unpredictable, and capable of extreme behavior. She was also, by her own later account, acutely focused on money, and specifically on the fortune she believed she would inherit from her elderly father, Harold Deal. The problem, from Deal Armstrong's perspective, was that Harold Deal was still alive. Harold Deal was an elderly man of modest but real assets. From Deal Armstrong's perspective, the inheritance she expected from him was the financial foundation of her future. She talked about it. She calculated it. People who knew her described a woman who returned to the subject of her father's estate with an obsessive regularity that went beyond normal anticipation of inheritance. It was something closer to fixation, the certainty that money was owed to her, that she deserved it, and that the only obstacle between her and what she was owed was the continued existence of an old man who refused to die on her schedule. The second figure at the center of this case was Kenneth Barnes, a man in his 50s who had known both Wells and Deal Armstrong. Barnes was a small-time criminal with his own financial desperation. He owed debts he could not service. He needed money. And Deal Armstrong, investigators would later establish, had approached him with a proposition. She wanted her father eliminated. She wanted someone to arrange it. In exchange, she told Barnes, she would pay him from the inheritance she expected to receive after Harold Deal was gone. Barnes did not have the resources or the contacts to act on that immediately. But he had a problem of his own, and an idea began to form that would bring Brian Wells into the equation in a way Wells almost certainly did not fully understand. The plan, as federal investigators would eventually reconstruct it, worked like this. A bank robbery would be staged. Wells would carry it out, coerced through the threat of the collar device. The money would go partly to Barnes to fund the arranged act against Harold Deal, with Deal Armstrong benefiting from the subsequent inheritance. Wells, in the scheme as constructed, was expendable. The device around his neck was real. It was always intended to detonate. I spent hours going through the case file, and one detail kept nagging me: the level of technical sophistication required to build that device. Whoever constructed it had specific knowledge. The collar bomb was not a prop. It was functional, and that meant the FBI's investigation was not going to start and end with motive. It was going to have to trace the hardware itself. Special agent in charge of the FBI's Pittsburgh field office at the time was Robert Rudge. The Pittsburgh field office, which covers the western Pennsylvania region, including Erie County, opened the investigation as a federal bank robbery case with an immediate secondary focus on the explosive device. The case was logged under the Pittsburgh field office's jurisdiction in the days immediately following August 28, 2003. The bomb itself became the first major investigative thread. ATF explosives experts and FBI forensic technicians examined the device components. What they found was not commercial ordnance. The collar had been constructed from custom parts, pipe sections, wiring configurations, timer mechanisms. The components bore the characteristics of something assembled by hand over a period of time, by someone with at least a working knowledge of explosive construction. Every component was a potential lead: suppliers, purchase records, anyone who might have sold or provided the materials. Investigators from the FBI's evidence response team photographed every fragment recovered from the scene. They cataloged components, measured blast radius, documented the wound patterns, and began reconstructing the device from what remained. Each piece of metal was a potential forensic fingerprint, the kind that links an object to a source, a purchase, a person who handled it. The device itself was, in a technical sense, a remarkable piece of criminal engineering. Not because it was sophisticated in the way military ordnance is sophisticated, but because it had been constructed to serve a very specific purpose. It needed to be small enough to fit around a human neck. It needed to be convincing enough that law enforcement would treat it as a credible threat and keep their distance. And it needed to be functional enough to detonate on command or on a timer, eliminating the one man who could connect the conspirators to the bank. Forensic analysis found that the device contained 4 steel pipe bombs arranged around a central locking mechanism. The keyhole had been welded shut. There was no way for Wells to remove it himself once it had been locked in place. Early in the investigation, something became clear that shifted the entire framing of the case. Brian Wells had not been a fully unwitting bystander, plucked at random off the street moments before the robbery. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, and witness accounts placed Wells in the area around a specific television transmission tower on Peach Street, the same area where Deal Armstrong and Barnes had known connections, in the period leading up to August 28th. The tower site was a location Wells had visited before. He had a history of contact with people connected to the property. This created a significant investigative and public perception problem. If Wells had not been entirely coerced at the last moment, if he had some foreknowledge of the plan, the narrative of a purely innocent hostage became more complicated. The FBI would spend years trying to establish exactly what Wells knew, what he had been told, and at what point the situation had moved beyond anything he could have anticipated or escaped. What's most surprising about this case isn't the device itself. It's what the investigation revealed about how much Brian Wells may have understood about what was about to happen to him, and how little that knowledge may have been able to help him. Even partial awareness of a plan does not mean you can simply walk away when the device is already locked around your neck and the people who put it there are watching. The investigation ran into its first significant obstacle in the months following August 2003. Physical evidence from the device pointed to materials that were not easily traceable. The components had been sourced in ways that did not immediately yield a clear chain of custody. Witness interviews produced conflicting accounts. The network of relationships between Wells, Barnes, and Deal Armstrong was not immediately apparent from surface-level inquiry. 3 months into the investigation, agents had significant forensic material, but a trail that kept fragmenting before it reached a definitive conclusion. The breakthrough came through a combination of electronic surveillance and the cooperation of individuals within the peripheral network around Barnes and Diehl Armstrong. Phone records were subpoenaed. Call logs were analyzed. A pattern of contact emerged between Barnes, Diehl Armstrong, and locations connected to the planning of the scheme. Agents working the case documented dozens of calls made between Barnes and Diehl Armstrong in the months before August 28th. The calls came in clusters, periods of heavy contact followed by silence, then another burst of activity. Investigators identified a pattern consistent with the kind of planning conversation that people engaged in criminal conspiracy tend to have. Back and forth contact as details are worked out, silence while individual tasks are completed, then renewed contact as a deadline approaches. The phone records did not capture the content of those conversations, but they established that these two people were in sustained, deliberate contact throughout the period when the scheme was being assembled. That pattern, combined with everything else the investigation would eventually produce, was devastating to any defense that claimed no coordination had occurred. Kenneth Barnes became the first figure to crack. Barnes, facing the weight of the federal investigation and understanding the potential charges he was looking at, entered into cooperation discussions with federal prosecutors. What he provided was a detailed account of the arrangement with Diehl Armstrong. He described the proposal she had made regarding her father. He described the financial arrangement. He described the role Wells had been recruited to play. He confirmed that the device had been constructed with the intent to detonate after the robbery, ensuring Wells would not be in a position to provide testimony or identification. Barnes's cooperation gave investigators the framework, but framework is not conviction. They needed corroboration. The process of corroborating Barnes's account involved investigators working backward through every claim he made, identifying the physical or electronic evidence that could independently confirm what he described. When Barnes said a call had occurred, agents pulled the phone records. When Barnes described a meeting at a specific location, agents canvassed that area for witnesses and surveillance footage. When Barnes described the financial terms of the arrangement, agents examined financial records for any transaction that might reflect the exchange. Some of what Barnes described was not independently verifiable. Conversations that left no record, exchanges of cash that generated no paper trail. But enough of it was. Enough of the specific factual claims Barnes made about dates and locations and communications could be confirmed by evidence that had nothing to do with Barnes himself. That independent corroboration was what prosecutors needed to present Barnes as a credible witness, rather than a self-interested informant spinning a story. Federal agents from the Pittsburgh field office, working with the Erie County District Attorney's Office, and ATF colleagues began building the corroborating case around Diehl Armstrong. They had phone records. They had Barnes's account. They needed physical evidence and additional witness testimony that would hold up before a federal jury. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface, and yet it is documented. Diehl Armstrong, despite her documented history with the criminal justice system and her understanding of how investigations worked, had not been careful enough. She had made calls. She had left traces. The same volatility that characterized her behavior in day-to-day life had produced moments of careless communication during the planning phase. Among the evidence gathered during the investigation were recordings and communications that placed Diehl Armstrong in contact with Barnes and others during the period of the scheme's development. The investigation also extended to the construction of the device itself. A man named Floyd Stockton, who had lived at a residence connected to Diehl Armstrong, would later be identified as having knowledge of the device's construction, though he was ultimately not charged due to an immunity arrangement related to another case. What strikes me about this case is not just the criminal architecture, it is what it reveals about the intersection of severe mental illness and premeditated violence. Diehl Armstrong was not operating in a fugue state. The plan she constructed was multi-step, involved multiple co-conspirators, required months of preparation, and included a contingency for eliminating the one person who could most easily link her to the bank. Whatever the psychiatric record said about her impulse control, The planning she demonstrated here was cold and calculated. The investigation also broadened to include the threat against Harold Deal. Barnes, in his cooperation, described Deal Armstrong's fixation on her father's assets and her determination to accelerate her access to them by the most direct means available. Harold Deal, who was alive throughout the investigation period, was never harmed. But the fact that a plan had been in motion to arrange his death added a second layer of federal exposure for the conspirators. Federal investigators also examined an event that had occurred in July 2003, approximately 6 weeks before the bank robbery. Bill Rothstein, a man with connections to Deal Armstrong, had called Erie police to report a body in a chest freezer at his property on Peach Street. The body was that of James Roden, who had been in a relationship with Deal Armstrong. Deal Armstrong was arrested in connection with Roden's death and charged with first-degree murder. The timing was not coincidental, as investigators came to understand. Roden had been aware of the bank robbery scheme. He had become a liability. The FBI's investigation into the collar bomb and the Erie County prosecution for Roden's murder ran on parallel tracks for years, each case generating evidence that informed the other. Rothstein himself died of cancer in 2004 before he could face charges, taking with him whatever additional information he carried about the full scope of what had been planned at that Peach Street property. By mid-2005, federal prosecutors had built a substantial case file. Barnes had cooperated, forensic evidence had been documented, electronic records had been analyzed, the outlines of the indictment were clear, and then the case ran into a wall that would delay its conclusion for years. Marjorie Deal Armstrong's mental health. This was not a simple procedural question. Deal Armstrong had a documented history of psychiatric hospitalization dating back decades. Her defense attorneys immediately raised the question of competency, whether she was capable of understanding the proceedings against her and assisting in her own defense. Federal law requires that a defendant be mentally competent before trial can proceed. If a defendant is found incompetent, the court must pause the proceedings and attempt to restore competency before moving forward. The competency evaluation stretched. Deal Armstrong was examined by court-appointed psychiatric professionals. She was examined at federal medical facilities. The findings were contested. She was determined incompetent. She was sent for treatment. She returned. The process repeated. The case that had been ready for trial sat in procedural suspension for year after year while the mental health questions played out in federal court. During this period, FBI Special Agent Jerry Clark continued to maintain the case file and work the outstanding investigative threads that had not yet been fully resolved. He was not the kind of agent who filed a completed case and moved on. He stayed close to the evidence, close to the witnesses, close to every detail that might become important when the case finally reached a courtroom. Investigators who worked long-running federal cases understood that the biggest risk during extended delays was entropy. Witnesses moved, memories faded, physical evidence degraded, and the institutional momentum that had driven the investigation in its early phase dissipated. Clark worked against that entropy. He kept the case alive while the competency proceedings ground through the federal court system at their own pace. This is where the case tests patience, not just the public's, but the investigators who had built the file. Every delay was, in a sense, a second victimization of Brian Wells and his family. The answers were on the table, the evidence was documented, and the judicial process required waiting for a woman who, investigators and prosecutors believed, was fully aware of what she had done. Here is the take that will probably get us some pushback. The extended competency proceedings in the Deal Armstrong case represent a genuine failure of the system's ability to balance procedural fairness with the reality of how mental illness intersects with premeditated criminal behavior. The competency standard is not designed to assess guilt, but when a defendant with a documented history of strategic, calculating behavior uses that same psychiatric history as a procedural lever, the process can feel less like justice and more like obstruction. Most accounts of this case dance around this point. The delay was not just a legal formality, it was years of additional suffering for a family that had already lost everything. What do you think? Did the federal system fail Brian Wells' family by allowing the competency proceedings to stretch as long as they did? Or was the process a necessary safeguard, regardless of the outcome? The central question of the case had never really been whether Diehl Armstrong and Barnes were responsible. The evidence, by the time it was fully assembled, pointed clearly in one direction. The question was whether a federal jury would ever get to hear it. And the longer the competency proceedings ran, the more that question hung over the case as an open loop that prosecutors could not close. Kenneth Barnes was sentenced in 2008. He received 45 years in federal prison on charges including use of a destructive device, resulting in death and solicitation of murder. He was the first of the conspirators to face final judgment. His cooperation had been credited by prosecutors, but the charges against him were severe enough that the sentence remained substantial. Barnes had spent years providing the account that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case against Diehl Armstrong. His testimony, combined with the electronic records and forensic evidence, was the thread that connected Diehl Armstrong to every layer of the scheme. And finally, in 2009, Marjorie Diehl Armstrong was determined competent to stand trial. The trial of United States versus Marjorie Armstrong began in the United States District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania. The lead prosecutor was Assistant United States Attorney Marshall Piccinini, who had worked the case for years alongside FBI Special Agent Jerry Clark, one of the primary case agents whose work had been central to building the evidentiary record. Jerry Clark had spent years on this case. He later co-authored a book about the investigation with journalist Ed Palatella of the Erie Times-News, which served as one of the primary documentary records of how the FBI's investigation unfolded from the inside. Clark's persistence through the competency delays and the procedural complexity of the case represented what the FBI's Pittsburgh field office characterized as one of the most sustained investigative efforts in its regional history. The trial produced testimony that gave the jury the full architecture of the conspiracy. Barnes testified in detail. Physical evidence from the device was presented. Cell phone records were entered into evidence. The history of Diehl Armstrong's relationship with her father's estate and her communications with Barnes regarding the arrangement for his removal were laid out methodically. Diehl Armstrong did not sit quietly through the proceedings. She argued with her own defense attorneys repeatedly during the trial. She attempted at various points to represent herself, a request the court denied. She interrupted testimony. She disputed characterizations from the witness stand in real time, inserting herself into the proceedings in ways that drew sustained attention from the jury and required the judge to repeatedly intervene, whatever the competency evaluations had found and not found over the preceding years. The woman who sat in that federal courtroom in 2010 was engaged, aware of her surroundings, and deeply invested in the outcome. Whether that behavior helped or hurt her with the jury was something observers debated at length. What it demonstrated was that Marjorie Diehl Armstrong understood exactly what was happening to her. One of the significant challenges for prosecutors was translating the complexity of the conspiracy into a narrative that a jury could follow across multiple legal theories of liability. The charges included bank robbery, using a destructive device resulting in death, and conspiracy. The question of whether Diehl Armstrong could be held liable as an architect of a scheme in which she was not physically present at the bank on August 28th required careful legal construction. Her defense argued that Barnes was an unreliable witness whose cooperation agreement gave him every incentive to implicate her. Prosecutors addressed this by ensuring that Barnes's account was corroborated at every significant point by independent evidence. The phone records, the electronic communications, the forensic trail from the device itself. The case they built did not ask the jury to take Barnes's word for anything that could be independently verified. The defense also revisited the mental illness argument at trial, not as a competency question, but as a potential basis for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, echoing the outcome of the 1984 proceeding involving the death of Robert Thomas. The jury rejected this defense. On November 1, 2010, Marjorie Diehl Armstrong was convicted on all counts: bank robbery, using a destructive device during a violent crime, resulting in death. The verdict came after deliberations that reflected the jury's careful consideration of the evidence assembled over 7 years of investigation. The sentencing hearing took place on February 28, 2011. United States District Court Judge Sean McLaughlin sentenced Deal Armstrong to life in federal prison plus 30 years. No possibility of parole. At the sentencing, Judge McLaughlin described the crime as among the most heinous he had encountered in his judicial career. Marjorie Deal Armstrong would spend the rest of her life in federal custody. For investigators and prosecutors who had worked the case since August 2003, the conviction represented the conclusion of one of the longest-running federal criminal investigations in Western Pennsylvania's history. 7 years from the death of Brian Wells to the conviction of the woman prosecutors had identified as the scheme's primary architect. 7 years of forensic work, electronic surveillance, legal proceedings, competency hearings, and trial preparation. The case was closed, but one question had never fully been answered, and it would continue to sit at the center of discussions about the case for years afterward. What exactly had Brian Wells known? This is the sub-mystery that the official record has never fully resolved, and it is worth examining carefully because it shapes how we understand Wells as a figure in this story. The prosecution's theory, supported by Barnes's testimony and the physical and electronic evidence, established that Wells had been recruited into the scheme. He had been at the tower site on Peach Street in the period before August 28th. He had contact with the conspirators. But the exact scope of his understanding, whether he believed he was participating in a robbery with a fake device, whether he had been deceived about the device's lethality, whether at some point before or during the robbery, he realized the situation was more dangerous than he had been led to believe, was never definitively established in court because Wells was not alive to testify. One detail that stuck with me, going through the court transcripts and investigative accounts. In the parking lot, in those final minutes before the device detonated, Brian Wells told officers he knew who had done this to him. He gave them a name. He said he had been used. Whatever the full scope of his foreknowledge, something in those final minutes suggested he understood, at least partly, that he had been placed in an impossible position by people he knew. Put yourself in the position of the Erie police officers and FBI agents who arrived in that parking lot. They are looking at a man with a device locked around his neck. They cannot safely approach to disarm it. They are waiting for a bomb disposal technician who has not yet arrived. And the man standing in front of them is telling them who did this. He is giving them information. He is cooperating. And there is nothing they can do to save him in the time they have. The bomb disposal technician arrived approximately 1 minute after the device detonated. 1 minute. That detail appears in the investigative record and in the reporting of the Erie Times News, which covered the case more extensively than any other outlet over the 7 years of the investigation and prosecution. 1 minute. And then the case that had begun as a bank robbery became a homicide investigation, a conspiracy case, and one of the most complex federal criminal prosecutions in the region's history. The case of United States versus Marjorie Armstrong et al. Produced several important outcomes beyond the individual convictions. It prompted a review within federal law enforcement of how bomb-related hostage schemes should be handled at the scene, specifically the question of whether a subject in possession of a live device should be immediately isolated and whether bomb disposal resources should be pre-positioned in active bank robbery scenarios involving reported device threats. The tactical response on August 28, 2003 had followed standard procedures, but standard procedures had not accounted for a scenario quite like this one. The case also generated significant discussion within the federal legal community about the interaction between mental health law and federal criminal proceedings. The years of competency evaluation that delayed the trial raised questions about whether the federal competency restoration process was adequately calibrated for defendants whose mental health conditions were chronic and contested rather than acute and clearly treatable. The Deal Armstrong case was cited in subsequent discussions of federal competency law as an example of the procedural difficulties that could arise when psychiatric evaluation produced contested findings across multiple review periods. Marjorie Deal Armstrong died in federal custody on April 4, 2017, at the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Texas. She was 68 years old. The cause of death was breast cancer. She had been diagnosed while incarcerated and had sought through legal proceedings to be released to receive outside medical care. Those proceedings were unsuccessful. She died as a federal prisoner, serving the life plus 30-year sentence imposed by Judge McLaughlin in February 2011. Kenneth Barnes remains incarcerated. His 45-year sentence, imposed in 2008, means he will be in his 90s before any possible consideration of release. Harold Deal, the father whose inheritance had been at the center of his daughter's murderous calculations, survived the entire affair. He was alive during the investigation. He was alive during the trial. The man whose death had been contracted as the financial foundation of the scheme outlived both his daughter and the criminal enterprise she had built around his estate. There is something in that fact that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else in this case. A woman built a plan to profit from her own father's death. She arranged for someone to carry it out. She recruited a man she knew, gave him a role in a scheme she designed, armed him with a device that was always meant to detonate, and sent him into a bank. And her father lived. The inheritance she had been willing to do all of this for never materialized the way she had planned. The court transcripts in this case run to thousands of pages. If you have followed other cases from this period and want to go deeper on the forensic reconstruction of the device or the full scope of the Barnes Cooperation Agreement, drop a comment saying more and we'll cover the technical dimension of the investigation in detail. The pizza collar case, as it became known in true crime and federal law enforcement circles, resists any single lesson. It is a case about the intersection of desperation, mental illness, and extraordinary criminal ambition. It is a case about how federal investigations can hold together across years of procedural delay and still produce accountability. It is a case about a man who walked into a bank in Erie, Pennsylvania on a Thursday afternoon in August 2003 and never walked out. Brian Wells died at 3:18 p.m. on August 28, 2003. He was 46 years old. Whatever the full scope of his involvement or foreknowledge, he was the person who stood in that parking lot in the heat of a Pennsylvania summer afternoon, alone, with a device locked around his neck, asking for help that arrived 60 seconds too late. The FBI's Pittsburgh field office and the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Pennsylvania closed the case with the conviction of Marjorie Armstrong on November 1, 2010. It had taken 7 years, 3 conspirators, hundreds of pieces of forensic evidence, thousands of pages of electronic records, and one man's final words in a parking lot to get there. Justice in this case looked like a life sentence plus 30 years for the woman who designed it and 45 years for the man who built the device and recruited the victim. It looked like a trial that almost did not happen, delayed by mental health proceedings that stretched the case across nearly a decade. It looked ultimately like the federal system working the way it is supposed to work, slowly, methodically, and finally. Whether that is enough, whether any outcome could be enough, is a question that belongs to Brian Wells's family and to the people of Erie who watched it unfold. If you want to understand how federal investigators piece together conspiracies from the inside out, the forensics, the surveillance, the cooperation agreements, the case we're covering next goes even deeper into how the FBI unraveled a plot that was designed to have no witnesses at all. That case is next on this channel, and it starts where this one ends, with someone who thought they had thought of everything. If this case is new to you, hit subscribe. Every file we open on this channel is a case the FBI actually worked, real investigations, real consequences, and sometimes an outcome that took years longer than it should have, but arrived.